So there are two traditional ways to focus on the events of Palm Sunday and the Holy Week that is just in front of us. One focus is sometimes referred to as simply the triumphant entry. And it highlights the joy and the feeling of triumph that Jesus must have felt at the clamoring crowds and the symbolic use of palm branches. In Jesus' day, the palms were a sign of life and celebration, a religious symbol associated with the temple, and a political statement about who they thought Jesus was. The other focus is generally called the Passion story, and it throws the spotlight on the betrayals and darker elements of the last week of Jesus' life on earth. I have never been comfortable choosing one perspective or the other, because I believe that the triumphant entry into Jerusalem is a necessary contrast to the back alley betrayal of Good Friday. My practice has always been to view Holy Week holistically, with each element of or event emphasizing the disconnect with the one that came before. That, of course, is the reason we have communion today. It is appropriate for us to remember the Lord's table. The week ahead is one that is marked by charisma, character, conflict, and crucifixion. Charisma is what we celebrate on Palm Sunday. It's that triumphant entry into Jerusalem, riding on a borrowed mule, palm branches raised, and shouts of Hosanna ringing the air. After 3 years of itinerant ministry, Jesus and his followers are welcomed to the city like conquering heroes. As they should be, perhaps, since Jesus demonstrated his divine connection numerous times in front of skeptics and believers alike. Many healings took place of those considered to be untouchable. Jesus demonstrated a mastery of the sea and all the life that's in it. He performed the miracle of transforming water into wine. He demonstrated that he was an accomplished demon chaser. And he proved his role as a life giver. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Lazarus. I'm sure it was an inspirational scene, the rest of the week notwithstanding. Imagine the electricity of that moment. Crowds swarming to sing your praises. The Jewish leaders standing by with worried looks on their faces as they watch the one they call the King of the Jews disappear into the crowd. Most depictions of Jesus riding into Jerusalem have him smiling at the reception. Jesus was believed to be the Messiah, but for reasons that had nothing to do with his mission and ministry. The Jewish populace wanted a military Messiah, a political Messiah. What they got instead was not what they had been seeking. Instead, what they got was a chance to touch the face of God. The week ahead is about character. This coming week will reveal some dark aspects of the character of many of those involved as followers of Jesus. Most prominent among them, of course, is Judas. The consummate act of betrayal showed Judas to be someone of very low character, exposed him as a liar, a conspirator, a puppet, and a hypocrite. Yet, despite all of that, he plays an integral role in the resurrection story. In truth, Judas didn't see his actions as a betrayal. He instead thought he was doing the right thing for the ministry, even if that meant compromising Jesus' safety. There was Peter, the serial denier of knowing Jesus, let alone being one of his chosen apostles. He disclosed his human vulnerability when he was given the chance to be counted among Jesus' friends, and he denied him. Even so, Jesus forgives him, despite his failure, allowing him to ultimately fulfill his role as the rock on which the church is built. Then we had the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which demonstrated their lack of character and how quickly they turned on Jesus. They didn't want to have their trade and livelihoods disrupted. Theirs was a faith of convenience, shallow and easily distracted from God's message as it unfurled throughout Jesus' ministry. Lastly, we had the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who showed themselves to be insecure, cowardly, devious self-promoters who were not above using subterfuge and bribery to get Judas to do the betrayal that they called for. These men turned out to be paper tigers, incapable of serving as the moral center of Jewish life. They, of course, didn't see it that way. The week is also one of conflict. There's Jesus in the temple chasing the merchants from the sacred spaces that they've occupied, where they should never have been permitted to operate in the very first place. We here in the Wesleyan tradition, we say that we will never do commerce in the sanctuary. I know that some of our brethren in other faiths, other denominations, view it differently. But we do not do commerce here, in this room. This room is reserved for God's presence, not for the presence of money. We also see Jesus indiscriminately destroying the vendor's inventory, which is their means by which they generated their family's income. Even the money changers saw their wealth tossed across the temple floor, making it impossible for them to restore their livelihood. The arrest of Jesus and then the passing of him around from Pilate to Herod and back to Pilate was more evidence of the conflict. Pilate's brutal treatment of Jesus, even though he could find no criminal fault in him. The crowds demanding Barabbas, a known criminal, that he be released instead of Jesus. How quickly the crowds turned on the Christ when he turned out not to be who they thought he should be. When he routed the temple of the money changers and the merchants, the tide swung precipitously. And Jesus was now the enemy. And then, of course, the week is marked by crucifixion, which is perhaps one of the most barbaric methods of humiliating a human spirit. Death was slow to come and agonizing beyond most human endurance. It's made more so because of the extra steps taken to be certain that Jesus suffered more than most. Most, we don't see the lashes, the scourging of his back. We don't see the carrying of the cross bearing those wounds. We don't see the crown of thorns. We don't see the vinegar-soaked sponge held up to his lips. These were reserved for Jesus himself. The crowds showing themselves to be willing to receive a known criminal, someone who perhaps had even damaged them in some way. They preferred to welcome him back into their midst instead of the one called Jesus. I've always marveled at the crowd's abandonment of Jesus within only a few days of the rejoicing at his arrival. I don't think we have to look very far today to see those same character flaws in large portions of our society even today. None of it was a surprise to Jesus. He had foretold his impending death and his resurrection. Despite having that brief moment of human frailty in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he asked God to take the cup from him, beyond that, he is passive about what is to happen to him because he knows it is God's will. The week in front of us carries with it many straightforward insights about our own character and the nexus with absent commitment, faltering courage, image piety, that's the image that we have of ourselves being seen in church, and selfless sacrifice. It's up to us to comprehend the implications of these behaviors on our own lives, and if possible, to heed the warnings that they provide. The consequences of ignoring these clues may ultimately result in a life that's lived without the hope of resurrection and salvation. Look inside yourself and ask, is this what I choose to celebrate on this Palm Sunday? Is it okay for us to view Holy Week through one lens, focused on exhilaration, the loving crowds, and concurrently on another lens that is steeped in darkness and indefensible human duplicity? I think that we put our own hope for salvation at risk if we choose to ignore the possible consequences. Are the two distinct perspectives I've talked about, are they mutually exclusive? Or can they still teach successfully, even when they're conflated? I don't think we can honestly separate the two when considering the fulfillment of prophecy. My friends, the week in front of us does not invite us to pick and choose the parts of Jesus that we prefer. We cannot celebrate his arrival and ignore the cost of following him. The same road that is lined with palms leads inevitably to the cross. As we enter this Holy Week, may we resist the temptation to stop at the celebration and instead remain faithful to the whole story, because that is where hope, resurrection, and salvation are to be found. Amen.